Hello everybody. Let's talk today about something that is an integral part of what makes my business go for me. And that is connecting fantasy baseball with my sports card collecting, selling, and flipping. Since I was a little kid, I always collected cards and played fantasy baseball with my dad. I've been in a fantasy baseball league for as long as I can remember, honestly. I used to go with him to Minneapolis to his fantasy baseball drafts, meet all of his friends. I used to help him pick out players off the waiver wire. I considered myself a good drafter, even though I was absolutely terrible at it because I only drafted or wanted to draft my favorite players. And I was always just involved in his fantasy baseball league. And it was something that was near and dear. It was something I enjoyed. I did all the time. And I was really passionate about it. So when the opportunity came for me to have my own team and I got a little older, I took the opportunity and ran with it, both in his league and in other leagues. I'm in some leagues with some friends. I'm in some leagues with college buddies. And all of that kind of was an integral part of my childhood, and it went hand in hand with collecting sports cards. I remember being active in fantasy baseball while also collecting that player's cards because I liked them, and I enjoyed watching them play. And I used to collect some of my favorite players, Kirby Puckett, Ken Griffey Jr., Frank Thomas, Jim Tomei. The list goes on, right? And I think there is a inherent ability to connect those two things as we go. And it's something that I've always enjoyed and something that I've always done. So what I want to talk about today is how that connection can influence the cards you buy, how it can influence the excitement you have for those cards and for those players, some of the positives that come out of it, and some of the negatives that absolutely come out of it. So let's start right off the bat by what connects these two things. Well, with baseball, you have to do a lot of studying and researching player statistics and learning about the minor league players and learning about who's coming up this year and who's going to be hyped and who's going to be popular. And the same research goes into collecting sports cards. And so if you're doing one, naturally, you're probably going to do the other. The connection is easy and simple, and they go hand in hand. Now, you don't obviously have to do both of those things, and a lot of people don't. But for me, collecting cards is an exciting part of also playing fantasy baseball. So let's talk a little bit about what problems there are when you're trying to do both of those things. Well, if you believe in a player from a fantasy standpoint, that doesn't necessarily mean that their cards are going to be valuable. I have a lot of players that I really like for fantasy baseball this year and for years in the past, and I have bought cards of theirs, and I have added them to my collection, both when I was using a personal collection and after I've started selling and flipping. But I have added their cards thinking, oh man, since they're really good fantasy players, their cards must sell really well. Well, that's not always the case. And you have to be extra careful when you're purchasing cards from a standpoint of a fantasy baseball perspective, that there are other fantasy baseball players that also buy those cards, or people that like those cards. Now, there are exceptions to that rule that do work out. I think Cal Raleigh is the perfect example. The guy his cards were super cheap, and I bought a bunch of them because he was underrated, I thought, from a fantasy's perspective. Now, to be fair, I never thought the guy was going to hit 60 home runs, but I thought he was always a good player, and I thought 40 home runs was easily within his reach, and I thought he'd be predictably within 30 every year and be a really good hitter for the Mariners. And I was right on that front, and he took off and was even better than that. So his cards end up working out. Now let's talk about a few players that didn't work out, that were fantasy darlings. One of them that I can remember is Tim Beckham, and it was years and years ago now. but he was a massive prospect for the Tampa Bay Rays long before Wander Franco hit the scene, and we'll get to him in a minute. But Tim Beckham is a prime example of a guy that had all the hype in the world, was super sought out in the fantasy world, and everybody rose to the occasion on the card side and bought his cards like crazy. And he turned out to be a bust. I'm not saying that he wasn't a good ball player at times, but he was never ever the prospect that everybody thought he was going to be on the fantasy side. Another one that's still playing today that's a little more relevant is Henry Davis of the Pittsburgh Pirates. That guy was number one on everybody's fantasy baseball list. He was the highest drafted player on a ton of minor league rosters and dynasty leagues. Just a huge player. Everybody was so excited about him. They thought he was going to be Ivan Rodriguez 2.0 or Mike Piazza 2.0, and he just has not figured out how to hit major league pitching. And that happens sometimes. These guys have so much hype behind them, you just never know what you're going to get. And these are two examples of guys that fantasy said they're the best ever, they're going to be so fantastic, and then bam, cards are worthless. You've now spent a ton of money on their cards, and you just have a bunch of wasted cardboard. Another one that is a little different is Wander Franco. I know so many people in this hobby that lost their shirt on this guy. And I don't know if you know the story of how things went down with him, but he came up to a ton of fanfare, turned out to be great, got hurt, and then came back and was just the guy everybody thought he was going to be. And now he is in the Dominican Republic, and I don't know if he's in jail or what's going on with him down there. And so his cards have completely lost all their value. I've seen a few Whatnot streamers that every time they see his card come up in a lot, they cut them into pieces. And he's a disappointment, honestly. I mean, his cards were selling for thousands of dollars, and now they're worthless. I actually have a stack of them that I'm holding for a rainy day when I want to have a bonfire. So, like, honestly, there's no guarantee with these guys, and you can make some really big mistakes if you buy into cards based on fantasy relevance alone and not on your own instincts, other aspects of their baseball playing that you might believe to be either too hyped or not hyped enough. So you have to be extra careful with what you're buying into. Let's look at some examples now of players that did work out. I already talked about Cal Rowley, but one of the ones that to me worked out, which was fantasy relevant long before his cards got popular, which was Elly De La Cruz. I know that when his first Bowmans came out, a lot of people really liked him, and he was a great player, and everybody's excited. But I can tell you that from a fantasy perspective, we were watching this guy long before that. And everybody was so excited about him. So now that we've talked about some of the players that worked out and some of them that didn't work out, let's talk a little bit about what you can do to kind of work the fantasy experience into the card collecting. So if you're one of those people like me that does both fantasy baseball and you do sports card collecting or investing or flipping, what can you do to combat some of the negativity, or what can you do to really set yourself up for success while doing both of those things? Well, the great thing about the card community now is when those Bowman cards come out, the card community is all over these really hot players. Long before a lot of the fantasy community, especially the ones that don't do minor league drafts, even know about these players. I personally do a minor league draft in my league, and we know about them long before or right around the same time as the card collectors. But if you look at guys that come up in these Bowman draft classes and these Bowman Chrome classes, you understand that a lot of these guys, the fantasy community isn't talking about, because there's no relevance. They haven't played a single game. They haven't played any pro ball at all, and nobody knows their names. And so, like, you have to be more aware of those players before they hit the top 100 list when it comes to baseball cards. So a lot of times I go the other way around, where I use the baseball card collecting to really inform my fantasy baseball team. And I think that those are something that you can do that's super fun and simple. And a lot of times, if you just go into a Bowman draft break and you look up those players and how expensive they are, you're going to know before the top 100 class comes out how good some of these players might be, or their draft, or where their draft station is. Were they drafted in the first round by their major league team? Were they drafted in the 5th round? So one of those examples for me, is Cade Anderson of Seattle, which I talked about in a previous video. I didn't even know who this guy was, and I feel I feel completely out of the loop on him. And now that I've looked him up and I've researched him, he might be one of my picks in my minor league draft for my fantasy team this year, because I think he looks like the real deal. He could be the next big thing, the next big Skeens player, right? So I think you have to stay on top of some of this, but you have to be extra careful. And I think that if you have certain players that you're really interested in or you believe in, it's okay to double dip, to draft them in fantasy and buy their cards, right? Because if you really truly believe in them, there's a good chance that might work. And I have a prime experience with that. I was a huge James Wood fan. I believed that he was going to be everything and more, and I just bought into him like crazy, both on the fantasy side, where I drafted him in my fantasy baseball league, and from a baseball card perspective. You can go to my store and look up James Wood. I have James Wood coming out my ears, and I've sold a couple superfractors, I've sold a couple out of 5s, out of 10s, out of 25s, and I've sold them like crazy. And now, more than ever, his cards are doing so well, and everybody's really excited to see if he can get out of his funk from the end of last season. I, being one of them, and my fantasy team, expectations are really high. And I think you have to understand what you're getting yourself into when you do both, because you are, in essence, putting a lot of your eggs into one basket, right? You are doing it from a fantasy perspective, and you're doing it from a card collecting and investing perspective. So I would say just be careful when you do these kinds of things. Make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into. Don't dig yourself too deep into a hole with this. But if you believe in a guy, go to town. Do your thing. Just understand that you're setting yourself up for a higher risk. So thank you so much for stopping by and listening to the video today. If you made it this far, I so appreciate your time. I so appreciate that you listened. But tell me what you think. Are you a fantasy guy? Are you a sports collector guy? Or are you doing both of those things? I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for dropping by. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Oh, and don't forget, like, subscribe, comment, do all the things, hit all the buttons, and thank you again. See you in the next one.